Today we are looking at the Quran in English, because I don't speak Arabic. It's, I gather, written around about, over several years, around about the year 630-ish, so very, very old. I suppose you'd have to give writing credit to Muhammad, the angel Gabriel, and God, which I suppose makes this book unique. I think it's the only book that claims to be written by God. This channel, anyway, is a spin-off of what I was already doing as a project where I'm reading through the Bible. And I've been doing that for about a year, and the more I've been reading that, the more I've sort of wondered about other things. And one of the things I wondered about was the Quran. My understanding is that the God of Christianity, Judaism and Islam is the same guy, the God of Abraham. So in my head, my assumption was like the Old Testament would look a lot like the Quran. So I thought I'd get it, read it and find out. I must stress here, though, that this is not a Quran study, as it were. All I've literally done is buy the book and fly through it. This channel is not intended to be a deep study on anything. It's literally born out of the idea that half the books I've read, I can't remember some of the stuff that's in them, and you have to go back through and flick through and work it out again. So the idea was I record my thoughts on them, and then I've got a sort of a reference for myself in terms of what each one has. I realise, therefore, that I will not be doing this book justice, and that this is a very important book to a lot of people. So I acknowledge right here I will be missing a lot of the nuance in this. I realise also that you're supposed to read the Quran in Arabic, but I googled this and it turns out apparently only about 20% of Muslims actually speak Arabic. So, yeah, complicated, but worth a go anyway. My first surprise was that it's nothing at all like the Bible, actually. There was a lot of crossover in terms of the stories. There's Noah's in there and Abraham and even Jesus is in there. But it's done in a very sort of bitty fashion almost. It's spoken about, Moses is talked about at the beginning of the Quran and at the end of the Quran and in the middle of the Quran. It's all over. And I was somewhat blown away by the difference in size. The Bible is, granted there are different versions of the Bible, but the Bible is somewhere around about 10 times the size of the Quran. It does beg the question of, are you supposed to read the Bible before you read the Quran? Because the Quran doesn't quite reference the Bible, but it talks about the Gospels. So it's almost like you need to read the Bible first and then come back and read the Quran as the sort of bolt-on top. It's certainly several hundred years newer than the oldest copy of the Bible that we still have today. The Bible was around when this was written, is basically what I'm saying there. But of course the obvious problem there is that the Bible conflicts quite heavily with the Quran. So I don't quite understand how that came to be a thing, that the Quran talks about the Gospels being right, but the Gospels say things that mean that the Quran can't be right. So complicated thing to try and reconcile there, but fortunately not my job to do that, so we're going to move on. I thought Allah was supposed to be basically indifferent to people, and Islam is all about submission. I believe the word Islam even means submission. But it talks very early on about Allah having love for humans, and it's a vast use of the word merciful and Allah the beneficent and all the rest of it. So he's talked of in very softer terms than I was expecting. And there is certainly more talk of punishment and negative things than there is of love. So you can see where people get the idea from, that Allah doesn't really care and it's all about submission. But that idea does technically conflict with what's actually in the book. It kind of reads almost like some sort of manifesto. Is that the right word? It goes with the Bible, just tells massive story over a huge chunk of time, and from that some meanings are drawn, and from what people have done and what people have said you can pull that out. The Quran is more just a statement of you will do this, I will do that, and all the rest of it, with a little bit of story, but not told in particularly story terms, more just sort of a reference to Moses led people out of Egypt, wherever that was. That's that sort of level of it. So it's profoundly different to the Bible in that respect. And there's an awful lot of focus in the Quran on believers and non-believers, where non-believers equals burn in hell. That may be metaphorical, and to be fair, believe or non-belief in translation terms might incorporate a lot more in the word. Like, for example, you say to believe in something means that not only that you believe it in your head, but you actually then act upon it as well. And I think without being fluent in ancient Arabic, it would be well, I'm not in a position certainly to work out if that's true or not. But then, to be fair, it does on the flip side say that all you have to do is basically be good to people, submit to God, and believe in God. It is very keen on prayer. You do have to do lots of prayer. That's quite explicit in terms of that. And is it burqas that the Muslim women have to wear? That's explicit as well. It's not really helped my understanding of Islam particularly, but nevertheless interesting to have read it. I don't know if it's just my YouTube, because I'm doing a lot of talking about religion on the other channel. So certainly I'm seeing a lot of talk at the minute about Islam being a religion of non-peace, or a religion of violence. And it doesn't seem that that's fair based on the Quran. I mean, if you cherry pick parts from the Old Testament in particular, but I mean the Bible in general, you could make that look like a religion of genocide and punishment and setting fire to people and just awful, awful stuff. But to do that cherry picking is to miss the point that's in there. So I don't know if that's what's happening with Islam to some extent as well. I mean, obviously there are people doing things that aren't helping, but it just reads like, I am God, do this stuff, I'll look after you. And it's with some frizzy detail around that. And clearly that frizzy detail is where some people get some funny ideas. But yeah, on the whole, it doesn't read like a religion of violence. Or at least no more than the Old Testament does, in parts. I did a video a while back on my other channel, I'll put a link at the end of this one, to a book by Christopher Hitchens, that he was basically making the point that religion is the root of all evil. Basically my conclusion to that was that the problem isn't necessarily the religion, and we was talking about Christianity at that point. The problem is people doing stuff they're not being taught to do. So it's a punk problem, not a religion problem. Without having only just flown through the Quran, I can't say the same for that at all, obviously. But it does feel, I mean, I'm left with the impression, which is all this is supposed to be, I'm left with the impression that might well be the case for Islam as well. It's people not doing what they're told, they're just twisting things to make, yes, I'm going to go and crash this plane into this building or whatever. On the negative side, it has this weird thread running through it, where it seems to make the case that the book is true because it says it's true, and it's got this very unsatisfying circularity about it, which is just utterly unconvincing as evidence, obviously. But it does have this interesting bit where it makes several points where it flags different things and makes the point that surely that's evidence for a thinking people. And that's great, isn't it? I mean, the fact that the universe exists, surely this is evidence for those who think, and consciousness, surely that's evidence for those who think. And you think, well, yes, it is. I think that is reasonable, that is evidence. But it's not exactly conclusive evidence, is it? I mean, it's just because we don't understand why doesn't mean to say we never will understand where that's all come from and all the rest of it. So, but I like that it pulls that out, because I think it is reasonable that those things are sort of flag posts around life. Is like, this stuff needs to be thought about, because, it could be significant and meaningful. But it's in using that in the book to try and justify itself, it's a little bit unsophisticated, I think, in terms of evidence. And in that respect, I guess you'd have to say it is a lot less sophisticated than the Bible, and not just because it's only 10% the length, but also because the Bible conveys massive meaning through complicated stories, or sometimes through simple stories, but huge ideas put through there, whereas this is kind of almost like I don't mean this to sound derogatory, but like a Donald Trump speech where he's telling you how great he is. It's kind of how the Quran comes across in a lot of it, whereas the Bible just doesn't have that angle at all, despite the fact in some of the Old Testament God does a lot of things of I am the Lord, you will fear me, and all the rest. So he does talk in similar ways than Allah is portrayed in the Quran. But on the whole, they're definitely not the same thing, albeit they're not claiming to be the same thing either, are they? Because, I mean, the Bible isn't written by God, it's written by people to tell stories, to convey meaning about God. Whereas the Quran is, I believe, supposed to be actual, in theory, indirectly, a book written by God. Yeah, so I find, personally for me, not convincing. Jury's still out in the Bible. There's also the serious deviation between the Bible and the Quran in terms of the people who promoted the Bible basically after Jesus was killed, his disciples who then built the early church and went off and promoted it, they all had massive incentives not to do that because they end up getting killed and not very nicely. So they died horribly and had terrible lives because of their faith. Muhammad, on the other hand, as I understand it, basically, well, the Quran sort of elevates him almost to, not quite to God level, but substantially elevates him above everybody else, which I guess would equate to why he has such a standing in Muslim society as he does. But the trouble is, of course, then he had an incentive to go into a cave and make stuff up. You know, it's kind of, it's you've got to ask the question, is this stuff true? So it doesn't seem to be any evidence that I'm aware of to prove that it's true that he was in this cave because he was by himself and all the rest of it. And then there's a massive incentive for him to have done that. So yeah, it's a difficult one. So yeah, I mean, worth a read. I mean, it's not fun. It's not easy to read. Obviously, because it's really old, and the Old Testament's no easier to. In fact, the Old Testament perhaps is harder to read and harder going, and certainly 10 times as long. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm glad I read it. It was interesting, very different to what I expected. If anyone thinks I've sort of missed anything massive in there that was kind of important and underpins the whole thing, I'd love to hear it. But otherwise, I'm on to the next book, and I shall post that video once I've finished that.